We are live.
Excellent. So good morning and welcome to the second Cardiovascular Health Tech Conference, which is sponsored by the IEEE Engineering and Medicine and Biology Technical Committee on Cardiopulmonary Systems and Physiology-Based Engineering. My name is Thomas Helt. I'm an associate professor in electrical and biomedical engineering at MIT, and I'm a past chair of the technical committee. I am the conference MC, and this is the second day of the second conference. We had an exciting panel yesterday of speakers on cuffless blood pressures, and I'm sure that today's session will be equally as exciting and interesting. We're also pleased that the conference is co-sponsored by the IEEE Engineering and Medicine and Biology Society Technical Committee on Wearable Biomedical Sensors and Systems, as well as the IEEE SPS Technical Committee on Applied Signal Processing Systems. Cardiovascular health tech field has generated broad interest from technologists who want to create devices for unprecedented cardiovascular monitoring, to clinicians who want to figure out how to best use these devices to mitigate the burden of the #1 killer worldwide, to companies who want to disseminate the devices to many people, to end users who want to take ownership of their health. Accordingly, the first Cardiovascular Health Tech Conference, which was held last year, was the most popular online EMBS conference during the pandemic, and I'm pleased to say that we exceeded this year the registration numbers that we achieved last year. In last year's conference, we covered cuffless blood pressure, sleep tracking, and atrial fibrillation screening. This year's conference comprises 3 two-hour sessions on 3 consecutive days that cover bloodless blood pressure, which was yesterday, which is the least mature of the 3 previous topics, congestive heart failure monitoring, which is the topic of today's discussion, and future of cardiovascular health tech, which will be discussed tomorrow. These sessions are intended to be interactive. So we encourage the audience to please submit questions via the Zoom Q&A. Your questions can also be directed to the speakers or the session chairs, and we will try our best to answer these either live during the discussions or by answering the chat Q&A. The sessions will also be recorded and made available via a private YouTube link, which will be emailed to all registrants soon after the conference. So let us begin with the topic of congestive heart failure, and it is my pleasure to introduce the session co-chairs. First, I would like to introduce Professor Maggie Delano. Maggie is an associate professor of engineering at Swarthmore College and a member of the IEEE Technical Committee in Cardiopulmonary Systems and Physiology-Based Engineering. They received their BS, MEng, and PhD degrees from MIT, and Maggie's research focuses on developing wearable cardiovascular monitoring devices, including a wearable ECG monitor for her master's and an ongoing wearable fluid status monitor project with applications in congestive heart failure and hemodialysis. I would also like to introduce Dr. Mohammed Saeed. Dr. Saeed is a cardiologist at the University of Michigan. He got his PhD from MIT and his MD from Harvard Medical School. Maybe just as one of his accomplishments, many of the listeners and the registrants out there might have heard about the MIMIC2 database, and it is used worldwide, one of the largest ICU database. And in fact, Mohammed's PhD was the originator of the MIMIC2 database. So we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for having the vision to put such a database together and doing the foundational work for that. Since then, he's moved on to clinical medicine and is an electrophysiologist at the University of Michigan. So with that, I'll turn it over to our session co-chairs, and I look forward to the presentations and the discussions. Maggie and Mohammed.
Thank you, Thomas. It's my pleasure to first introduce our first panelist, Dr. William Abraham from Ohio State University. Dr. Abraham received his MD from Harvard Medical School. He is board certified in internal medicine, advanced heart failure, and transplant cardiology. He's previously been at University of Colorado, University of Cincinnati, and University of Kentucky before settling down at Ohio State. At Ohio State, he's had several leadership positions, including the role of Associate Dean. He's been director of the Clinical Trials Management Organization and managed the College of Medicine's non-cancer clinical and translational research portfolio for over 1,800 studies. As division director, Dr. Abraham developed one of the largest and most successful academic programs of cardiovascular medicine in the US. He's also been recognized for the last 20 years as amongst the top 10 physicians nationally for patient satisfaction. Dr. Abraham's research activities focus on elucidating basic mechanisms in heart failure and on clinical drug and device development in heart failure. Dr. Abraham has received grants from the NIH for more than $11 million over the last 5 years, including also from American College of Cardiology and Aetna Quality Care Foundation. He has made major contributions to advancing basic and clinical science in heart failure in several areas, including neurohormonal mechanisms, cardiorenal interactions, and relationships between sleep and heart failure. Dr. Abraham has also participated in all clinical and regulatory phases of new drug and device development for heart failure, frequently as national or international principal investigator from phase 1 through phase 3 trials. His work has led to approval and adoption of several therapies for heart failure, including beta blockers, natriuretic peptides, cardiac resynchronization therapy, ultrafiltration, non-invasive and implantable hemodynamic monitoring systems, transvenous phrenic nerve stimulation, cardiac contractility modulation, transcatheter mitral valve repair, and baroreflex activity therapy. I can tell you as a cardiologist, looks like he's done it all. And on top of all that, 1,500 original papers, abstracts, book chapters, and reviews in some of the most highly acclaimed journals, including New England Journal, Lancet, JAMA, Circulation, JACC, and European Heart Journal. He serves on several different editorial boards and has also received the Distinguished Scientist Award from the American College of Cardiology, as well as a Pioneer Award from the Heart Failure Society. So we are truly privileged today to have Dr. Abraham on our panel. So without further ado, I'll give it over to Dr. Abraham.
Mohammed, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Maggie, Thomas, other panelists, really, it's a pleasure to join you today. Let me share my screen with you, and I'll spend the next 25 minutes or so really providing you with an overview and a perspective on remote heart failure monitoring to reduce heart failure hospitalizations. We've made a lot of progress over the past 3 decades. We still have work to do because, as I'll share with you in a moment, heart failure remains a major and growing public health concern. So let's take a look at some of the statistics. Why is this important? And I'll share with you the epidemiology of heart failure in the US, but really these numbers can be extrapolated to virtually all geographies around the world. Because heart failure is a global pandemic affecting at least 60 million people worldwide. In the United States, you'll see on the table the prevalence, the incidence, the morbidity and mortality associated with heart failure. But for time's sake, suffice it to say that heart failure results in substantial morbidity and mortality. It's also associated with a high degree of disability for many of our heart failure patients. None of this is going to change over the past decade or two. In fact, both the incidence and prevalence of heart failure continue to climb, as do the economic costs of heart failure, both in the US and worldwide. Now, I want to emphasize that heart failure not only has a substantial impact on morbidity and mortality, but it also leads to a substantial reduction in quality of life and a high symptom burden on a daily basis for our patients. For example, 75%, about 3 out of every 4 of our heart failure patients, find it difficult to carry out usual daily activities. So our goals of heart failure include not only reductions in morbidity and mortality, but also improvements in functional capacity, patient symptoms and health status, and the avoidance of the need for advanced surgical heart failure therapies such as left ventricular assist devices or cardiac transplantation. In sum, our overriding goal for heart failure patients is to keep them well and to keep them out of the hospital. So how do we keep heart failure patients well and out of the hospital? Well, while our chronic therapy of heart failure relies primarily on neurohormonal inhibitors and antagonists and certain electrophysiological devices, it turns out that managing fluid volume and intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressure status is key in keeping patients well and out of the hospital. Because that is if our patients are volume overloaded. If they're too wet, they have increased symptoms, they're at increased risk of hospitalization, they're at increased risk of arrhythmias, as well as mortality. On the other hand, if we over-diurese our patients, if we make them too dry, they often have low blood pressures, dizziness, lightheadedness, they're at risk for syncope, and they may develop worsening kidney function or outright acute kidney injury. So really the goal here is to get this just right, because when the patients are neither too wet or too dry, when we achieve an optimal volume status or a normal volume status, our patients feel well and they're at the lowest risk for hospitalization or death. So how do we accomplish this through remote monitoring technologies? Well, what I'm going to share with you on this slide was published in 2021, is about 25 years, is based on about 25 years of experience with new device development, both non-invasive as well as implantable devices for remote monitoring of heart failure patients and the lessons learned over that period of time. So what do I see as the prerequisites for success for all of you out there who are engaged in the development of new approaches for the remote monitoring of heart failure patients? Here's what I think you need to pay attention to. First of all, you've got to measure the right signals. And in heart failure, what are the appropriate signals? Well, those are signals that measure the underlying pathophysiology leading to worsening heart failure symptoms and events. And I would say that those are measures of congestion, particularly lung congestion or pulmonary congestion, which may be reflected in increases or changes in intracardiac or pulmonary artery pressure or lung fluid content. Now, of course, the sensors have to measure these signals accurately. They have to be well validated. And I'm going to suggest that it is better to provide absolute values rather than relative ones, and I'll tell you why in a few moments. So, for example, and we're going to hear a lot about the use of pulmonary artery pressure as a guide to heart failure therapy. Knowing the numbers and being able to measure them in absolute terms gets us to the fourth A here, and that is the information must be directly actionable. We have to know what to do with it. Those types of diagnostics which predict risk but don't inform treatment are of lesser value than those systems which provide actionable information. And then finally, but actually it's not finally because I've added one more A after this, we need treatment algorithms to support clinical decision making. We've got to support these remote monitoring technologies with algorithms and clinical decision making tools that allow clinicians to take appropriate action when necessary. And finally, I've added one additional A to this list of prerequisites, and that's, of course, patients and clinicians must be adherent to the use of remote monitoring systems, because if patients don't take measurements and clinicians don't respond to them, you can't improve clinical outcomes. So now let me take you on this journey of where we started and I think where we're going in terms of remote monitoring and remote management of heart failure patients. And I'm going to use this figure from Phil Adamson that depicts sort of the journey or the road to heart failure decompensation, resulting in hospitalization, to tell you a story about what hasn't worked and what has worked and what the future might look like in this field of remote monitoring of heart failure. So first of all, we started many years ago with a focus on remote monitoring and management of heart failure patients' symptoms and changes in their daily weights. Now, to make a long story short, we have learned now with more than 24 large randomized controlled trials that managing patients on the basis of weight change and symptom change just doesn't work. And one of the reasons proposed for that is that, as you can see on this journey, those changes occur late, only within a couple or a few days of a heart failure hospitalization, and the window of opportunity for intervention is relatively short. In addition, as I'll show you in a moment, the sensitivity of these changes is relatively poor. So I'm going to call this era sort of the garbage in, garbage out period for remote monitoring of heart failure patients. Telemedicine focused on heart failure signs, symptoms, and daily weights. And the bottom line is that the signals in just aren't good enough to make a change in the output, that is to lower the risk of heart failure hospitalization. And while I mentioned there are dozens of studies that demonstrate the failure of this approach to heart failure remote monitoring, I'm just going to share with you one example. If you're interested in others, there's the TELE-HF trial, the first TIM-HF trial, and many others. But I share this trial with you, the BEAT-HF trial, because this is probably one of the most aggressive approaches to telemanagement of heart failure patients using signs, symptoms, and daily weight changes. Performed at 6 academic medical centers in California. First author is Ong, but really one of the drivers behind this was Greg Fonarow, who has worked in this arena for more than 30 years. And look at the intervention. It combined health coaching, telephone calls, and telemonitoring, daily electronic collection of blood pressure, heart rate, symptoms, and weight changes, and centralized nurses who conducted telemonitoring reviews, implemented protocolized actions, and made frequent telephone calls to these patients. Now, if there's any approach that should have worked, if not via everything that was collected, but via some placebo effect, it would be this study. And the bottom line is that there was absolutely no difference between the intervention arm and the usual care arm in this study when looking at either 30-day or 180-day outcomes, when looking at readmissions or mortality. Absolutely no difference shown here. So this trial is a great example of the failure of what we have done forever in the remote monitoring of our heart failure patients. And at least one reason is that the input, the signal here, just isn't good enough. Here you can see that the sensitivity of weight change in predicting a heart failure hospitalization is quite low. If it happens, the specificity is high, but the problem is that the sensitivity of daily weight monitoring, weight change in predicting a heart failure hospitalization is only about 10 or 20%. We miss most events, and we're not able to keep very many patients out of the hospital. Now, the next era that I'll move on to here is the era looking at physiological markers of acute decompensation, such as changes in transthoracic or intrathoracic impedance and measures of autonomic adaptation, for example, changes in heart rate variability. And these, at least standing on their own, have been of limited value. Now, there are emerging approaches to look at multi-parameter metrics and come up with and combine them with machine learning to come up with more actionable data. But at least to this point in time, these approaches have been limited. Now, I'll call this the era of as of yet unfulfilled promises, but I think the promise still exists here. And this is telemonitoring or telemedicine focused on cardiac implantable electronic device-based physiological markers. And here are the type of measurements that we can get from these devices. We can get resting or nighttime heart rate variability, patient activity level, intrathoracic impedance, arrhythmia monitoring. We can look at ventricular rate response during AF. We can look at the delivery of therapies such as cardiac resynchronization therapy and how frequently our patients receive arrhythmia therapies such as VT episodes and shocks. Now, the only true randomized controlled trial to date using these approaches and focusing on changes in intrathoracic impedance is the DOT-HF trial. a prospective randomized controlled intervention trial of intrathoracic impedance monitoring with a treatment arm and a control arm as defined here, and a composite endpoint of all-cause mortality and heart failure hospitalization. You can see the type of the patients that were enrolled in this trial. Now, the hypothesis was that changes in intrathoracic impedance, and remember, these are relative changes. Intrathoracic impedance doesn't tell us when the lungs are normally dry and when wet, quantitatively how wet they are. But the hypothesis here was that intrathoracic impedance might increase outpatient contact with the patient, but would result in a significant reduction in heart failure hospitalizations. What happened in this trial? Well, you can see that, in fact, there were more outpatient clinic visits in the treatment arm, about 3 times as many, 240 versus 84, but there wasn't a reduction in heart failure hospitalizations. As a matter of fact, there was a nearly 2-fold increase in heart failure hospitalizations seen in this trial. Why? Well, I don't know for sure, but I think one of the reasons is that when the alert went off and the impedance signal indicated that the patient might be becoming wetter, patients worried, clinicians worried, but they weren't quite sure what to do because the data wasn't directly actionable. So when you worry and don't know what to do, what are you inclined to do? You're inclined to go to the hospital or to admit your patient to the hospital. So I think this demonstrates the limitation, at least with where we've been previously with some of these implantable device-based technologies. So now let's take a look what is the earliest change on the road to decompensation of heart failure leading to hospitalization. And those are changes in intracardiac or pulmonary artery pressure or lung fluid changes. These happen early on. Initially, they are asymptomatic. We'll call this hemodynamic congestion as opposed to clinical congestion, which may only be manifest late in this journey to hospitalization. And these changes occur so early, in general, about 3 weeks on average prior to a heart failure hospitalization, that they give us a very broad window of opportunity for intervention to avert a heart failure hospitalization. So maybe we got it just right here during this period of telemonitoring focused on intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressure or absolute measurement of lung fluid content. And really, I think this era was ushered in through the development of implantable hemodynamic monitors, old and now no longer under study right ventricular pressure sensors, such as the Chronicle implantable RV hemodynamic monitoring system studied in the 90s and 2000s, PA pressure sensors, and now left atrial pressure sensors. So let me tell you where we began with the Compass HF trial of the Chronicle device. This study was a small study. It was underpowered for a primary endpoint. It evaluated a concept of optivolemia. There were no pressure targets utilized. Patients weren't treated to a normal estimated pulmonary artery diastolic pressure. But despite all of that, we learned a lot from this study. First, we learned that there was a clear relationship between pulmonary artery diastolic pressure and the risk for heart failure events. And we saw that really if patients had a PA diastolic pressure in the range of about 8 to 18 or 8 to 20, patients were at their lowest risk of a heart failure event. And there was a near linear increase in a risk of a heart failure hospitalization as the pressures rose above a range of 20 or 25. So we could define this as too wet, and this range is too dry, and this was really the just right range for pressure-guided heart failure therapy. We also demonstrated in these studies that changes in pulmonary artery diastolic pressure were associated with changes in mortality, and that a 5-millimeter reduction in the pulmonary artery diastolic pressure was associated with a 30% survival benefit. So this showed us the promise for pulmonary artery pressure guided heart failure therapy. We just didn't get it quite right in this initial study and using an RV pressure sensor that estimated the PAD. So this led us into the next generation of implantable hemodynamic monitors, which could directly measure pulmonary artery pressure. This pulmonary artery pressure monitoring system, also known as the CardioMEMS HF system, is depicted on this slide. You're going to hear about a similar system in the next presentation, but you can see it's a small wireless batteryless pressure sensor. It's deployed in the branch of the pulmonary artery. It's interrogated on a daily basis using an external home electronic system, and it gives us both absolute PA pressure data as well as trended data, as that's shown in the lower right-hand figure on this slide. And the goal here is to lower the pressures into the normal range and keep them there. It's a proactive approach to heart failure management based on knowledge of pulmonary artery pressure. It was first studied in the CHAMPION trial that used an algorithm, the algorithm shown on this slide with target values for pulmonary artery pressure. And the algorithms were quite simple. If the PA pressure was too high, lower it with a diuretic, as shown on this example. And if it was too low, of course, you could cut the dose of the diuretic or hold the diuretic until it was restored into the normal range. This slide shows our journey of CardioMEMS HF system studies over the past decade. And I'll just add, not shown on this slide, the Monitor HF study performed in Europe. Another randomized controlled trial of CardioMEMS is being presented later this month at the ESC heart failure meeting as a late-breaking clinical trial presentation. But really, all along this journey, all of these studies have demonstrated very consistent, very concordant results. There are now 2 published prospective trials, 3 prospective observational, prospective randomized controlled trials, 3 prospective observational studies, at least 2 retrospective studies that have all demonstrated the benefits of pulmonary artery pressure guided heart failure therapy in keeping patients out of the hospital and improving their quality of life. So this is quickly becoming a standard of care remote monitoring and patient management system in our heart failure patients. We can talk during our discussion about whether or not patients should all receive an invasive solution, because I think there are attractive non-invasive solutions as well, and perhaps picking the right solution for the right patient really is the the goal here as these monitoring systems continue to emerge. But CardioMEMS, I think, really sets the bar for what is needed in a remote telemanagement system for heart failure. Now, you'll hear again about another PA pressure sensor in a few moments from Harry Rowland, but let me show you an example of another approach, and this is the direct measurement of left atrial pressure with this sensor. This, again, is a miniature wireless battery-free implantable sensor. It's implanted in the interatrial septum. It is powered and interrogated using an external electronic system, this belt or sash-like system that goes over the patient's shoulder, provides the energy, collects the data, processes it, and sends it out to a cloud-based system for the clinician to use. And it will ultimately be studied using this paradigm of physician-directed patient self-management, which, like the diabetic who uses a glucometer to self-manage their diabetes, their blood sugar, within physician-prescribed guidelines will allow the patient to self-manage their left atrial pressure within physician-prescribed guidelines. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a non-invasive technology that is proven useful in clinical management. And this is absolute measurement of lung fluid content using the REDS-based technology from Sensible Medical. It's a 90-second measurement that uses a RF or radar-based technology to create an absolute measurement of lung fluid content. We know that normal lungs are comprised of between 20 to 35% fluid. So if the measurement's 40%, the lung is wet. And if the measurement is 45%, the lung is wetter. And so the use of this system is based on an algorithm that looks very analogous to what we use with CardioMEMS, but here using the lung fluid content on a percent basis to consider the patient hypervolemic, hypovolemic, or euvolemic in that target range. And again, with this system, the goal is to keep patients within that normal, sort of lung wetness value between 20 and 35 or 25 and 35%. It looks very much like the CardioMEMS measurement. You can see quantitatively at the start, this patient example, the patient's lungs are wet. The REDS value is about 45. The patient is acutely diuresed down into this normal range and then just kept there. And that keeps the patient well and keeps the patient out of the hospital. And there's now a lot of evidence, although not yet that definitive large-scale prospective randomized controlled trial, but there have been a number of small randomized trials and a lot of larger observational studies now in about 4,000 patients and 50 clinical studies worldwide that support the utility of REDS as a guide to heart failure therapy. So now let me just conclude with emerging technologies. I think telemonitoring focused on integration of multiple physiological and behavioral inputs, both implantable devices and wearable devices that collect a lot of information about our patients and then integrate that, often using machine learning, into a single number or a single risk profile that may be actionable and associated with treatment algorithms. Speech processing technology is one of the most exciting emerging technologies, at least for me. And then there are many, many others. And I'm just going to show you forward-looking because you're going to hear from Omar about some of these multi-parameter technologies that are emerging subsequently. I just want to show you one technology here that I think is exciting. And this is using speech processing to remotely detect changes in lung fluid content. This particular system, called the Cardio Hero technology, is an application on the patient's phone, either iOS or Android platforms. It creates a patient-specific speech model during a clinically stable state. It compares that model against daily speech samples and can detect changes related to lung fluid. The patients act as their own control. It's language independent. In a study that we performed looking to gain proof of concept, can we differentiate wet from dry lungs? We studied 40 adult patients in the hospital during an episode of acute decompensated heart failure. And to make a long story short, we demonstrated this system could identify voice alterations reflective of heart failure status. And we've now deployed this into a community-based study in ambulatory heart failure patients, looking at the ability of this technology to predict future worsening heart failure events, hospitalizations or worsening heart failure as an outpatient, requiring IV diuretic treatment. And we've demonstrated to date an 80% sensitivity associated with a low false positive rate. And like REDS, like CardioMEMS, this system can detect these heart failure hospitalizations on average about 3 weeks prior to the worsening heart failure event. So let me conclude with this slide and summarize what I've presented. First of all, weight changes and heart failure symptoms represent unreliable, late, and only indirect markers of heart failure decompensation and don't help us keep many patients out of the hospital. Physiological markers may be used in risk stratification, but at least to date have not been demonstrated to be actionable. I think in the future that may change with machine learning and AI application. Perhaps we'll really understand how to use these multi-parameter physiological measures to keep heart failure patients out of the hospital. And at least today, I think the proven approaches which enable proactive and personalized heart failure management are focused on absolute measurement of intracardiac or pulmonary artery pressure or lung fluid content. Some of the references that support these conclusions are shown at the bottom of this slide. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, bring my slides down, and be happy to address any questions that you have. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham. Just briefly, I want to ask just a couple questions, and then we'll move on to the next panelist. So, you talked a bit about the personalization, especially when you talked about CardioMEMS and these other technologies that do direct or indirect heart pressure measurement or estimation. So, in your mind, how do you develop a framework for patient selection and identifying which patients are likely to get benefit from either an invasive monitoring modality versus a non-invasive monitoring modality, and how can we implement that in a clinical environment?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we've learned, particularly from studies using implantable hemodynamic monitors, is that patients who are doing well already and start with low intracardiac and pulmonary pressures tend to do well going forward as well. And so I think the goal here is selecting patients who tend to have elevated intracardiac or pulmonary artery pressures, who tend to be at higher risk for future heart failure events. For example, by virtue of having had a recent heart failure event in the past, or having elevated levels of BNP or NT-proBNP, or other markers of future events. So, one is picking patients that are at risk for future events. And then, my approach to considering non-invasive versus implantables is, I think the non-invasives play a great role in that period early after a heart failure hospitalization, where we're titrating GEDMT, when we're trying to determine what the patient's future risks of an event are, where we're trying to prevent early relapse and early rehospitalization during that early vulnerable period in those patients, but not yet commit those patients to an implantable device, because some of them will stabilize and become at low risk for a future event and not really require an invasive solution, whereas others, will continue to have events despite that non-invasive monitoring, and then I think they should be escalated to an implantable device.
Great. And I just want to pick one question from the audience, and that's from Alex Jaffe. Has the REDS device been tested against a thoracic impedance measurement?
Yeah, so I don't believe that there's a direct comparison between them. What we know from prior studies of both transthoracic and intrathoracic impedance monitoring, has been, this issue of them only showing relative change. Now, there are some approaches to impedance-based monitoring that or measurement that are getting close to providing more absolute measures, but at least previously, these have primarily indicated relative change. And both with the BioZ device, the transthoracic, one of the transthoracic approaches, as well as the Medtronic's OptiVol system, we haven't been able to show that those relative measures result in a reduction in heart failure events. But I think that is an area that is continuing to advance and perhaps will be more successful in the future.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Dr. Abraham. There are plenty more questions from the audience, but hopefully we'll get to some of those during our end panel discussion. Thank you again.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for that presentation. I have so many questions. Really looking forward to the panel discussion later. So we're going to continue on with the session today, and then we're going to hear a talk from Harry Rowland and Angad Singh. So I'm just going to introduce the two of them briefly. So Harry Rowland is co-founder and CEO of Endotronics. Dr. Rowland has led the company's operations, strategy, and technology development since its inception. His vision has been integral in raising over $100 million in VC and strategic financing and building the company to 100 plus people. Dr. Rowland received his PhD in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, a BS in mechanical engineering, and an MA in economics from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Rowland has authored or presented numerous conference and journal papers in internationally recognized peer-reviewed publications such as Science and Nano, with his work referenced in over 500 scholarly articles. He also has more than 15 issued patents and several pending applications. I'd also like to introduce Angad Singh. So Angad is a CTO at Endotronics and has over 20 years of technology development and product leadership experience in commercialization of groundbreaking medical products, with a strong focus on cardiovascular market. He served as Vice President of Engineering and Operations at CardioMEMS, which we just heard a little bit about, which is now part of Abbott Laboratories, the first company to commercialize implantable wireless sensors for disease monitoring. Mr. Singh's technical expertise and leadership were crucial in transition of their aortic abdominal aneurysm, AAA, and heart failure, HF, monitoring products from concept to commercialization and revenues in excess of $100 million. More recently, Mr. Singh co-founded Polaris Surgical, now part of Mirus, where he led the development and commercialization of next-generation surgical guidance systems and smart instrumentation to improve orthopedic and spine surgeries, including the award-winning Galileo spinal alignment monitoring system, first-of-a-kind real-time measurement and monitoring system. Prior positions include co-founder and chief technology officer at Microgen Systems, staff engineer at Sony, R&D engineer at the Berkeley Sensor and Actuator Center. Mr. Singh has an MS degree in electrical engineering and applied physics from Case Western, and a BS degree in electrical engineering from the Visvesvaraya National Institute of Technology in India. So really looking forward to hearing from Harry and Angad, and I'll let the two of you take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction and having us here. It's truly an honor. It's an honor to follow Dr. Abraham. I think it's quite poetic, really. I've been following him in his pioneering work my whole career. I got my PhD from Georgia Tech, which is where CardioMEMS came from. I had no idea at the time that I would be in this area. I happened to meet Angad while I was a graduate student there, and delighted for Angad to speak and share his journey as an engineer supporting the development of these technologies. So very exciting talk here. We're going to cover an introduction to the Cordella system, which is a next generation system following the pathway of CardioMEMS. Angad will be able to speak on the journey across both technologies and challenges faced by implantable sensors generally. And then we'll talk a little bit about the development process from the company perspective in bringing technologies to market and into standard of care. So wonderful introduction. I don't have to go too much in heart failure. I will say, coming in as an engineer, you have a naive view. You ask a lot of naive questions like why, and you learn about things from a different perspective. And one thing, when we look at heart failure, really look at the system of care delivery and recognition that our current model of care delivery in the US is absolutely fantastic at acute care and saving lives with acute care. So you think about very complex workflows. They are very well established in the acute care domain, not necessarily in the chronic care domain. So that's an area where our health system needs to innovate. That's what's leading to all the stats that Dr. Abraham mentioned. And when we look at heart failure, it's often quoted that around 2% of the population has heart failure, while 1% of the population has pulmonary hypertension, and it's group 2 pulmonary hypertension, which is high pressures on top of heart failure. And this is leading to high mortality rates, as Dr. Abraham presented. As these pressures go up, risk of mortality goes up. So really, we think about how do we reduce the burden of secondary pulmonary hypertension on heart failure and improve outcomes in these patients. And that really goes beyond monitoring into management strategies. Dr. Abraham presented the classic, iconic triangle of symptom growth before hospitalization. Pressures are key. High pressures show up with these patients in the hospital, getting those pressures down. is really the gold standard for management, or becoming the gold standard for heart failure management. And at Endotronics, when we came into this, again, with a new perspective and an engineer's view, trying to understand this space, yes, weight and symptoms have not been effective as a monitoring strategy in reducing heart failure. But if you step back and think about this as how do we improve management of chronic heart failure patients at risk broadly, well, when we think about medical change decisions, it does help to know congestion and vital signs. And we also want to engage patients in self-management and educate them in self-care. So these themes all come together when you think about how do we improve chronic heart failure management and outcomes broadly beyond just monitoring to see that there is a need for action. So our system brings these themes together. Similar to CardioMEMS, we have a pressure sensor that gets implanted in the pulmonary artery. We go to a different location as we allow patients to use a handheld device from the chest, and there's anatomical considerations to where you implant in the body to get a reliable signal for patients to read from the chest. We wrap around that a digital health platform where we also measure weight and blood pressure and get that health symptom information from patients, not as a trigger for monitoring or action, but when the clinician needs to come in and make a decision, it helps to know what else is going on with the patient. We deliver all that information to the clinician. Primarily, it's a nurse user on the front line of triage and medical management, working under the direction of a heart failure cardiologist and cardiology team. So the implantation is similar to CardioMEMS. It's a right heart catheterization, Swan-Ganz catheterization. These pulmonary artery catheters have been used in clinical medicine for over 30 years, millions of times a year. So long practice in measuring congestion and hemodynamics through the pulmonary artery with the PA catheter. Once we do the right heart cath, you put a guide wire in place after your imaging, then you insert our delivery device, deploy, leave the sensor in place. And then from there, the patient can start their home monitoring routine, which enables management. So it's a simple measurement every day, and we really had to think hard and design this for you're asking a patient to do this every day for the rest of their life. It's a big commitment. Getting an implant is a big commitment. So doing this in a way that it's going to be a simple routine that they can follow every day, they can engage in their care, and that's what leads to benefit over time. It was the fifth A, the adherence, that we think about very deeply here. So it's a measurement session, less than 5 minutes a day as you're starting your day, either before or after you take your meds, or after your coffee, whatever the physician and doctor decide. And then we get that information to the clinician and trend that over time. So when the clinician needs to make a decision, they have rich information and insights so they know exactly what to do. They're very confident in their care. So we built the management portal about actionable follow-up. Again, this is not, we don't think about this as heart failure monitoring. The talk of this session is heart failure monitoring. We think about heart failure management and care delivery. So how this information gets notified, gets flagged, patient is at risk. The nurse can go and follow these care protocols, primarily diuretic therapy, but often guideline-directed medical therapy adjustment as well, education of the patient, and then getting that patient into a new routine, a new habit, a change of behavior that can have long-lasting implications on their outcomes. So with that, I'm going to pause and turn it over to Angad, talk about implantable systems broadly, and then I'll pick it up at the end.
Thanks, Harry, and thank you, Maggie, for the introduction. Pleasure to be here with all the panelists, Dr. Abraham, other panelists, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here. As Harry has mentioned, my background, I've spent 15 years in developing implantable pulmonary artery sensors, 12 of those at CardioMEMS. Joined CardioMEMS as a MEMS engineer back in the day when there was still a garage startup, and really saw the company through its journey from development to trials. We had an abdominal aneurysm product, first one commercial in 2005 as a stepping stone towards heart failure. And then finally doing the pivotal trial for heart failure and getting approval. So that journey was tremendously fulfilling. And then I've had a chance to do it all over again, maybe bigger and better with Endotronics, where I've been for the last 3 years. So really my perspective on the space is from an engineer's perspective as a developer of technology, and being involved in 2 different companies in that space. I hope to give some unique perspectives. I really talk about what it takes to develop an implantable system, what the bar is. Dr. Abraham talked about CardioMEMS setting a high bar. I agree, it's a high bar. And I'll talk about what that bar is in terms of technology development and what you have to do to really prove safety and efficacy in this space. So first slide. So Harry and we were talking about, the risk of going after Dr. Abraham is that he's going to make some of your slides redundant. So this first slide is about why do an implantable sensor. He's already made the point about having the right signal to monitor, a signal that's actionable, that leads to better outcomes. And it's been proven that intracardiac pressures, in a way, maybe it's oversimplified, but in a similar way in diabetes, where the glucose measurements are important for diabetes management. In a similar way, intracardiac pressures can help manage heart failure. And these pressures, without an implantable system that you go home with and take home readings, the way to do this is in the cath lab. So the problem we're trying to solve with these technologies is to enable measurement of this very important parameter at home in a very seamless, easy to use fashion. So in terms of a bit of history in this space, again, Dr. Abraham has talked about the Medtronic Chronicle device, which is sort of a lead-based device. We kind of call it a can-based system. The lead goes to a can that's put subcutaneously inside the patient. It has a power source, and that measures the intracardiac pressure, which in this case is right ventricular pressure. And from that pressure, you can estimate diastolic pressure. So whether you're measuring right ventricular pressure, left atrial pressure, or pulmonary artery pressure, the goal is the same. The goal is that these signals will provide you an early warning indicator of potential decompensation so you can act in a timely fashion and prevent that from happening. So the Chronicle device, as Dr. Abrahams mentioned, the clinical trial results showed some very positive trends that other companies, frankly, have built upon and developed further. But it did not meet its primary endpoint in the trials. It did not get FDA approval. So it was proven to be safe, but not effective. There's another device that was measuring left atrial pressure called the HeartPod. This came out of a company called Salvacor, which was acquired by St. Jude, which was then acquired by Abbott as part of Abbott. And this device was also a lead-based device. Again, lead goes to a can that's placed subcutaneously. And this device did a clinical trial to show efficacy, and they had very good effectiveness data. Unfortunately, they had a lot of complications with the device, probably because it required a transeptal hole to be made. And because of that, the pivotal trial was stopped early. So they were unable to prove a satisfactory safety profile and did not get FDA approval. And so CardioMEMS then came along and with their passive wireless scheme. So the previous two devices I've talked about are sort of your lead-based devices. CardioMEMS took on a passive wireless approach, i.e. the device does not have any leads or batteries. And that really led to it having a very good safety profile. So in the trials they did, they were able to prove very good safety as well as effectiveness. So effectiveness here was, can you prevent heart failure hospitalizations using this information? And they had really good results. And that led to FDA approval. So CardioMEMS is currently the only FDA-approved product for pulmonary artery monitoring or any kind of intracardiac monitoring implantable system. And as Dr. Abraham said, it sets a high bar, and Endotronix is hopes to be the next company in that space with a device that has improved form factor, facilitating easier daily measurements in a seated position, along with measuring other vitals that along with the PA pressure can give you a more complete, a more comprehensive view of the patient's status and lead to more personalized treatment. So Endotronix is currently in the process of doing its pivotal trial, which we expect for it to lead to FDA approval. Next slide. So here I'm going to become a bit of an engineer, talk about, okay, technically, what are the challenges you face? So as I've mentioned, the goal is safety and effectiveness for the device. When we talk about safety, it's not just the device itself. Obviously, the device, the implant itself has to be biocompatible, safe inside the body, last for the life of the patient without hurting the patient. But you also have to look at the procedure to put the implant in the body. That's extremely important. And so you have to look at both those aspects for safety. Then effectiveness, the things that matter there are performance, particularly long-term performance. This is not, we're not monitoring an acute disease, it's a chronic disease. The device has to perform accurately for the life of the patient. So typical testing times you do for the devices is on the order of 10 years. As a period you have to prove performance. The other important aspect is ease of use. Patient adherence is extremely important. If the patient is not taking these measurements on a daily basis or on a frequent basis, then you can't act on an information. So really, that has to become a big part of your development effort. How do you get to a form factor, a usability scenario that's actually going to promote patient engagement in the technology? And the other piece that's really important, already mentioned, is the treatment guidelines. You cannot ignore that. The device itself has no therapeutic benefit. The benefit comes from acting on the information. So it has to be actionable information paired with treatment guidelines that clinicians can adopt and adhere to. And so for me, in terms of technology development, these are my top three challenges. The other challenges are not in here, but I'm going to give my perspective. So number one, the long-term sensor performance is a challenging thing to achieve. And that's a big challenge for people in the space. And then once you have put a sensor in the body that's going to last life of the patient, how do you get the information out of the body in a reliable and robust way? That's another challenge that goes into how you design the system. And then how do you package everything into a small enough form factor that you can deploy this using a safe procedure, preferably a minimally invasive procedure. So I'm going to dig into a little bit into how you can go about these challenges and what building blocks there are that you can leverage. So go to the next slide. So yeah, given those challenges, given all the requirements you have for this device, so you got long-term stability, reliability, safety, as I mentioned, extremely important. The other requirements. So what happens is that all these requirements put tremendous pressure on the design space. It really squeezes you into few options that you can look into. And I'm going to present those options here. They're not the only options you can use. This is, again, things that have worked in these two companies I've been involved in. So I want to share that with everyone. So the design space really gets squeezed, and you kind of start looking into things like passive wireless telemetry. So again, if you look at a lead-based device or something with a battery source, it affects their reliability and safety profile. You don't want the battery to run out. You don't want leads to break or fatigue over time. So this passive wireless technology's building block is extremely valuable in this space. And this concept has been around for a while. In fact, this picture that I have here is from an article in Nature magazine in 1956, where they talk about this pill you can swallow that uses a passive wireless scheme, and that gives you a pH and temperature information as it makes its way down your gastric canal. So this passive wireless scheme at a very high level consists of a passive LC tank circuit, so inductive capacitor tank circuit. And you can tailor that circuit so that the pressure changes the capacitance changes as a function of pressure, and that results in a frequency change. So these circuits have a resonant frequency. The resonant frequency changes as a result of pressure changes, and that can be picked up by an external reader, which also has a coil that couples to the coil on the implant circuit. And so this basic concept was adopted by CardioMEMS. And the pictures I've shown you is the real world version of that electrical circuit for an implantable system. So you have the basic concept, but there are a lot of engineering details that you have to go through to get to the real world implementation that takes millions of dollars and many years. So, but that's what they use. They use this building block and really made it work in a reliable fashion for a daily use product. And so what happens is the implantable sensor has the LC circuit in it. It's constructed using MEMS technology, and it makes it a very small package that gets implanted. On the outside, you have a pillow that is a reader with a call in it as well, that then pings and listens to the signal. So you can ping it and listen to it. So it's almost like striking a guitar string. It rings down and you listen to it, and you repeat this more than 1,000 times a second to get a really high fidelity pressure waveform from inside the body. And then Endotronics adapted the same concept, but in a little different way. Endotronics went to a fixed frequency method, which really allowed the electronics to be simplified and miniaturized and shrunk down into a smaller form factor. And that resulted in a handheld reader versus a pillow for CardioMEMS. And the handheld reader facilitates reading at home in a seated position, along with supine if they want to do it that way, but although most patients prefer seated, and also facilitates using a vest to take ambulatory PA pressure measurements as they do exercise or go about their business. So that was one big building block. And then the second building block has to do with, okay, you're going to implement this passive wireless scheme. So you know what the circuit needs to be for the implant out to the reader, but how do you package everything together in a small form factor in a reliable fashion? And that's where the MEMS technology comes into the picture. So again, the art of MEMS has been around for a while. I was trained as a MEMS engineer, and the techniques to really build these circuits in a small enough form factor have been around for a while. It's a question of adapting that for an implantable system. You know, how can you make that package be biostable, biocompatible inside the body? That's what the challenge is. And what CardioMEMS did their own adaptation of it. So as a MEMS technology, the circuit is encapsulated inside a fused silica housing, which is hermetically sealed. The fused silica housing is biocompatible. It's got a silicone coating on top of it. So everything on the outside is biocompatible. And you can make the circuit, which it can have very tight dimensions here. So for example, the capacitor gap in some of these circuits can be as small as 1 micron. So you have 2 plates with 1 micron gap. If you really scale this up into a football field dimension, you can imagine 2 football fields with a 1-inch gap between them. That's how tight the tolerances are. So that's the power of MEMS technology. You can achieve those tolerances on a reliable basis. And you're able to pick up nanometer deflections, very small deflections as a result of pressure changes. So that's what CardioMEMS has done. And Endotronics has also leveraged MEMS technology. Again, different adaptation, a different way of making it. That's the same goal. And the approach Endotronics has used actually maximize the internal volume inside the hermetic capsule and allows you to integrate electronics. So the device has a passive electronics inside of it. In the future, it can be an active electronics, but it has its own innovation there to allow that to happen. But the goal is the same, how to shrink everything down into a small package, hermetically sealed, reliable, that lasts the life of the patient. Next slide. The third building block I'll talk about has to do with, okay, you have designed your product, you have an implantable, a small implant and a reader. How do you get the implant inside the body, inside the heart? And this is where we can leverage the field of cardiac catheterizations. So people have been putting catheters into the heart for a while. The first right cath was in 1930. And so people have also developed ways to put the catheter in and then deliver devices. So stent devices are delivered using a wire, where the wire ties down the device on the catheter. The catheter goes into the right position, and then you pull the wire to release it. That concept has been adapted again by CardioMEMS for delivering the sensor using a catheter. So on the left is a picture of the sensor tied down on the catheter. And then once you get the catheter into the right location, you pull the wire to release it into the artery. And Endotronix has a similar concept with some differences. The delivery catheter is torqueable. It's a dual sheath design. The torqueability lets you control the orientation and position a little better. And the dual sheath design allows you to achieve calibration without having to exchange out another catheter. So again, basic concept is there. You have to adapt it. The engineering details you have to do, which takes years, millions of dollars, but there are ways you can overcome these challenges of the application. So just wanted to put out there the different phases that you have to go through to get to the final goal, which is safety and effectiveness. So obviously you start with the concept. Like I said, they're building blocks you can leverage, but those concepts have to be adapted. So sensor development and development of the reader telemetry system go really hand in hand, because ultimately it's one electrical circuit that's inductively coupled. That happens early. And then once the sensor development once you know what that's going to look like, you then start thinking about, okay, how I'm going to deploy it into the body and design that. So those three pieces happen very early on. You may file IP on your particular embodiments of those concepts, do animal studies to prove feasibility, and then prove biocompatibility with some rigorous testing that's done per standard. So once you do all of that, then you have to get into formal product development, which FDA requires you follow certain FDA regulations on how to develop products. You follow those design controls and get your first in human, prove safety, prove feasibility, and then you get to a pivotal trial, which typically is hundreds of patients, to prove effectiveness of your device. And while you're doing that, so you can do all your bench testing animals, but when you go to the real world and put it in humans, you always learn something. And so you're always applying those learnings. You're learning and then you're improving a device and iterating. So that happens for quite a while, longer than an engineer would want to think that it happens. And so you're always learning and improving. And then at the end of all of that, the final goal is FDA approval. And once you get that, you can commercialize. And it doesn't end there. You have to keep generating more evidence. And Dr. Abraham talked about CardioMEMS, how they have all these clinical studies. And really, I call it the evidence stack. You just keep stacking it up. And once you have enough evidence, then maybe you can change standard of care. So that was my last slide.
And with that, the transition to standard of care, I want to talk a little bit about that. So it's a long journey is the short version of the story. There's a lot happening in heart failure. These monitoring technologies I call enabling management technologies are part of that. And as the health system turns its focus not just on acute care to chronic care delivery in heart failure, more and more coming out. This is almost a trophy list of all Dr. Abraham's great technologies that he's brought out. So he's just been pioneering so much of this, and there's just much more to come. So it's a very exciting time. And as I mentioned, we talk about how do you get the device into first use, but that is really just the beginning. You need to go to first use to solving the patient access problem. And this is truly a game-changing technology that improves lives. How do you get it out to every patient who can benefit from it? So that is a multi-year development. As we think about this, as an engineers coming in, I think, are the Sherpas of these technologies, but really this is about physicians treating patients. And it always requires that pioneering innovator. Dr. Abraham is one of those key people in the heart failure space. You've seen it in other aspects of interventional cardiology, in the structural heart, recently in the xenotransplant last year. So it always requires physician passion, drive, and commitment. And when you look at just a case example, the structural heart valve, this is a generational process. So maybe it's not true for the wearable and software technology, but when you're thinking about PMA, class 3 high-risk implantable devices, it is a work of a lifetime. And the TAVR space started from surgical valves, and you're building on all the lessons and work of geniuses there. And then you're doing the engineering, you're running into problems, you're solving those problems. You have to build companies as you're building a product. And then as you're going through the clinical pathway, and ultimately you can get to standard of care. So more than a 20 to 30 year journey in heart valves, in TAVR space. Our journey's a long one as well, building on all the foundational work of Chronicle, CardioMEMS, and others. We had a long gap from when we were founded to when we were venture funded. A lot of that is it's hard to raise venture funding after a financial crisis, the 2008, 2009 collapse, and medtech venture funding dying down, and in a space where CardioMEMS as the pioneer is trying to work out, can we get a product like this approved by the FDA? So there's a lot of things that happen in the world while you're innovating and working through the process that Anga described, bench testing, animal testing, getting into first in human, doing your early clinical work. We recently just completed enrollment in our pivotal trial. So we're now over 600 patients into our experience, and we're in follow-up phase, hoping to get PMA approval next year, and then moving on and continuing that evidence development stack to move this towards standard of care. So while we're working on this journey on making these implantable sensors work, the world is changing. So iPhone came out in 2007, and that's when our company started, but that doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was really a long time ago. And then wearable technologies coming out, Google Glass, you have these Jawbones Fitbits. This is going to revolutionize the way we think about heart failure. Then it's wireless health or mobile health or digital health, all these apps. Recently, AI and machine learning, we're applying all this to the space. Now ChatGPT is out there. All the world keeps moving as you're developing these technologies, and the clinician and patient expectations are changing all the time. So you have to marry all this technology innovation with a regulated FDA process, managing risk, and being able to learn and adapt as you go. So it's a very exciting time. All this stuff is just getting started. You think about the technology development, the software development, patient, clinician, all of this has to come together for a successful product. And I think we're excited to hear about what's next with non-invasive systems, applying machine learning, AI to solve this problem as well. So thanks for the opportunity to speak. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Angad. We're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to skip the Q&A for this. But if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and they can answer them asynchronously, or we'll answer them during the open discussion that we'll have after Omer's talk. Thanks also, Harry, for teeing me up there. So I'll go ahead and introduce Omer. So Omer is professor and holder of the Linda J. and Mark C. Smith Endowed Chair in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Georgia Tech. He received his BS, MS, and PhD from Stanford University in electrical engineering, then went on to become the chief engineer at Countryman Associates, a professional audio manufacturer. Following his work at Countryman, he joined Georgia Tech in 2013 and has been there since. Dr. Anand has received several major awards, including a Technical Achievement Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and is a fellow of the American College of Cardiology and the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. He is a co-founder, board member, and chief scientific officer at CardioSense Incorporated, and I'll let him tell you all about their device.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for having me as part of this group. It's really an honor to be here, and I just want to thank also Rama and Thomas for putting this virtual health conference together through our TC. I think it's been a really great thing, and thank you also to the chair and co-chair for running the session. All right, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the work that my lab does at Georgia Tech that kind of was sort of the basis for some of the technologies that end up being licensed and going into CardioSense, and then I'm going to jump right into the discussion on CardioSense. So normally I have this disclosure slide. I guess in this case it's obvious because the whole point of the talk is on the work that is translated from the lab out into industry settings. So since I was a grad student, actually, I've always had this fascination with understanding actually the mechanical aspects of cardiovascular health and performance. And it's really interesting, I used to, of course, read many of Dr. Abraham's papers, and it's very interesting to see that the Endotronix and CardioMEMS story, of course, in some ways, came out of Georgia Tech as well, and it's very interesting to see sort of the way these worlds come together. And a lot of that is because of the fact that, sensing has come a long ways since we used to sort of do things like put our hands and feet into buckets of salt water to be able to connect to the string galvanometer and measure electrical signals from the heart, to the sorts of MEMS technologies that we were talking about. But this was sort of the early days of cardiac sensing. And actually, well before that, almost 100 years, we were not measuring electrical signals from the heart, but we were actually measuring acoustic signals. So the first sort of stethoscope and some of the discussion around that is super interesting, actually, getting into the history of how people thought about sensing and what sorts of sounds that people were listening into to try to make decisions about care. So I guess jumping really, really far ahead from there is some of the work that we've been doing around multimodal sensing with a chest patch. And I'm going to get into more of the details of this later, but I just want to sort of present this as our platform sensing technology that we've been using for non-invasive assessment of cardiovascular health, and specifically what we've been doing in heart failure. We've had some amazing collaborators that I've really been working with for almost 20 years now. Mazi Adamati is the director of advanced therapies now at Northwestern Medicine. You'll see some interesting pictures of him and me early on when we were first at Stanford as grad students and even undergrads as well later on. But he and I have been working together on this sort of technology, the concept of cardiogenic vibration signals, for quite some time now. And Livu Klein, who's the director of advanced heart failure therapies at UCSF, has been our close collaborator and friend on this project really from day one. So our patch has come a long way, in terms of the technology. It started as this rectangular circuit board with which one of my recent PhD grads actually kept one of them and framed it and gave it to me, so I'll be able to keep that forever. That was our earliest design that we had put together. It was sort of large, but it measured ECG and seismocardiogram signals from the chest. Seismocardiogram is this chest wall vibration signal that we leverage now to get mechanical information about pumping as well as filling from the outside of the chest. And so that kind of rectangular, large, and obtrusive kind of patch turned into what we used to call the hockey puck, because it was about that size, which was a pretty good system actually that we used at UCSF for studies in almost, I think, 250 patients with heart failure, ranging from really basic stuff where we're evaluating signal quality, moving into cardiopulmonary stress testing experiments where we were trying to correlate the parameters we were measuring with this device to VO2 changes in those patients, as well as studies with a 6-minute walk test, where we demonstrated that we were able to have an early detection of when the patient was congested and decompensated from a hemodynamic perspective with the way that they responded to exercise. And then we did quite a bit of experimentation at Georgia Tech with this patch as well to understand the physiology of what we were measuring. And all of that kind of led to the latest version of the patch, which we've been working on commercializing recently. So we have many papers that we've written that talk about the different signals that we measure with this patch technology and how those relate to clinical gold standard instruments. The latest stuff has been focused on correlations and comparisons to right heart cath. I'll get into that a little bit here. That really formed the basis for what we ended up spinning out from Georgia Tech. So moving away from heart failure just for a couple slides here, if you bear with me, I think that the scientific basis for some of the stuff that we're doing kind of makes a lot of sense, actually, if rather than thinking about volume overload, you first think about hypovolemia and the case where a person, or we'll get into some pig studies here that we did, but basically where a person is actually starved of the amount of preload or fluid that's required to be able to sustain the activities of the body. And this is relevant to many military as well as civilian health and performance scenarios. And so we actually had some funding from the Office of Naval Research through a Young Investigator Award that I was fortunate to receive, that was focused on developing some experiments to better understand how the signals that are actually captured by our patch now would respond to this hypovolemia sort of protocol. So concept was there could be, a device that goes on the person. That device could measure these sorts of signals. From there, you could have a volume status estimation that could be used for fluid resuscitation. And so we performed some pig studies. This was in close collaboration with a very good friend and collaborator of mine, Jino Han, who's at University of Maryland, also one of the organizers of the session yesterday, and he did a great job running that, of course. So we performed some studies where we were measuring these external signals together with internal, of course, left, in this case, left heart cath, as well as aortic pressure values. And what we determined was that we could basically have a monotonic kind of signal that could tell us volume status of the pig as it was being depleted of fluid through volume depletion, as well as relative hypovolemia studies. So we published this in Science Advances and kind of set the scientific basis for why these sorts of signals in the first place can be responsive to filling. And what's interesting, of course, when you think about sort of the physiology of the way that filling impacts cardiovascular performance, specifically Starling curves, in one sense with hypovolemia, what you have is you have a person who has a normal Starling curve, and of course you're reducing preload by, in that case, they're hemorrhaging and they're losing fluid. But in the same sort of way, of course, you might imagine someone with heart failure where you have volume overload and you are moving to higher values of preload in a heart that can't really sustain that. Maybe these signals could have some value there. So I don't have to talk about this slide, fortunately, because normally I have to explain it and talk about Dr. Abraham's kind of contributions to the science of this whole thing, but I was fortunate enough to let him do that for his talk. But essentially, the point here is that you have this, also, by the way, I don't have to probably talk about cardiomems at this point either, but you have this sort of spectrum of events that leads up to this acute decompensation. And our goal is to be able to non-invasively measure things that are at the early stage of this, at this spectrum. So what we did in some of our latest studies that we published in IEEE TPME, for those of you EMBS folks on this call, was that we measured basically right heart cath with the proper level of care, with Levi Klein performing these measurements together with our device. And we actually had 3-axis SCG as well as ECG measurements with the device. And then we formed models based on some of the changes that we saw in the training set to be able to estimate the changes in PCWP and PAP that resulted from vasodilator infusion for these patients. So basically there was an acute change in pulmonary capillary wedge pressure because of the vasodilator, and we noticed both changes in the timing and amplitudes of these signals, and formed machine learning algorithms to be able to extract from some of the features that we at this point have domain knowledge of based on other data sets. We formed these regression models to be able to estimate changes in these pressures, and we're able to achieve very high correlation for those changes, and agreement also in the test set that was held out from the algorithm. So this was kind of an exciting result for us, of course, and then sort of had this thought of where do we go from here. But I'm going to actually now take a big step back to our first meeting. So when I was first a professor at Georgia Tech, I actually flew over to UCSF, which is where we were already collaborating with Levi Klein and them on these projects. And it was exciting for a couple of my students to be able to actually be in that clinical environment. And now it's something that we do so much more often for the lab, but for engineers who are being trained in concepts like sensing and machine learning, to be able to actually get into the clinical setting and start thinking is a really special experience. And one of the things we started thinking about at that time was, there's a lot of these different non-invasive sensing modalities out there. Which one of these will actually yield the kind of information that can be actionable in patients with heart failure? And so, we thought a lot about signals at that time that could be measured from a weighing scale because of what my PhD thesis was and what work we were doing there. But we also thought about wearables and what sorts of things could be measured. And our goal was, to be able to achieve this sort of, if symptoms sort of change maybe a couple days before hospitalization, maybe we can beat that by a week or 2 weeks. That's kind of, what we were thinking at the time. So we brought a bunch of sensors to UCSF. We had the IRB set up and everything ready to go. We had some that were commercially available sensors with BioPack and these sorts of systems, but we also had some that were a custom sort of devices, both the weighing scale that we had modified at the time, as well as some accelerometers to measure SCG signals. But maybe the most important part of that trip was one of my students, who's now actually the CTO of CardioSense, Andrew Carrick. He got to watch a surgery where a CardioMEMS transducer was actually placed into a patient. And he still talks about it, that it was a completely life-changing experience for him, where he was thinking at the time, you know, how this is such an important device, this is going to make a difference in this person's life. And he actually got to talk to the patient as well and hear about their experience. And I think that really motivated him. One more digression, and then I'm going to get into the CardioSense slides. My friend Mazi Adamati, who is the other faculty co-founder of the company, you know, we've been having fun together for a long time. So we were grad students at Stanford together. So on the left, this is our first conference that we attended. Interestingly, also is where I first met Rama, which was at IEEE EMBS in 2008. And Mazi and I had a really unique experience at Stanford because we were in this lab led by Greg Kovacs, who's one of the most well-known people in the MEMS field. And at the same time, our associate advisor was Professor Woodrow, who is, of course, very well known for the Woodrow-Hoff LMS algorithm and adaptive filters, and really what people consider one of the founding fathers of neural networks in the first place. And so he invited us to this Silicon Valley Hall of Fame dinner, which Mazi and I will never forget, because in addition to Professor Woodrow, the person on the left there is Ted Hoff, who's one of the people credited for the microprocessor. So he was Woodrow's first PhD student. So we got to thinking about the sort of confluence of AI and physiology really early on. And we also got to play around with these signals. You know, Mazi and I were in the Echo lab at Stanford when we were just first in grad school, measuring things with our weighing scale and trying to correlate it to cardiac output from Echo. So we had this kind of mission in mind probably for a while, but it didn't come together until we founded CardioSense together with Andrew, who's the CTO, and Amit Gupta, who's the CEO, who at this point now I consider a very, very close friend. We've been working together closely for a few years now in this company, and he's just an amazing person who's allowed us to get the company to this point. So this is our mission. You know, we're a physiological waveform data platform company. So for us, really, the wearable device is interesting and exciting, but it's really about the data and the waveforms, and being able to combine both outside data sets that have been collected and aggregated with waveform data using our middleware software that I'll talk about in a second, together with the wearable device that we use, the CardioTag device, to be able to change the course of therapy for these patients with heart failure and also other sorts of diseases going forward. So we've had a really fortunate last 3 years. We were granted FDA breakthrough device designation for non-invasive heart failure monitoring algorithm. At this point, we have wonderful partners that have invested in our company, that believe in us, including Broadview Ventures, Hatteras, and these other ones listed here as well, Million Lives Fund. They have, in fact, I'm actually in Chicago right now for a board meeting for the company. So we just literally met with them yesterday, and we were lucky enough to raise 15 million Series A this last fall. So as I mentioned, the company has really 3 verticals. If you think of it from that standpoint, there's the device. So the CardioTag device, measuring these seismocardiogram, photoplethysmogram, multi-wavelength PPG, and ECG signals from the chest. We have WaveSense, which is this middleware software that allows us to aggregate both waveform data from our device, as well as from other third-party devices that could be used in the home or in the hospital setting. And then, of course, we have the AI that allows us to both use retrospective data sets for transfer learning kind of operations, as well as the current data that's being collected to make decisions ultimately, or actually to present data to someone who would make a decision. So, of course, the problem is huge. And again, boy, do I not have to get into this slide. And I think that, you know, currently, I think there's clear understanding at this point that implantable sensors are the state of the art for what's being used here to change the course of care. And of course, the challenge is that they're available to a small portion of the patient population with heart failure, at least currently. And so having a non-invasive alternative would be quite exciting if you could demonstrate that it can measure if you can hit the Abraham's principles for this sort of device, right? So we have the sensors. We've already talked about this sort of in the academic side of things. This device now is being finalized on the CardioSense side as CardioTag. We've already made hundreds of these. We're at the stage where we're getting close to finalizing this device over the coming months for regulatory submissions. The signals that we measure have been carefully crafted over the years of research, really, as being the ones that we believe have the highest value in this setting from a non-invasive standpoint. So as I mentioned, we started with a long list and down selected to the ones that we thought would be most valuable. Specifically, we have ECG, multi-wavelength PPG, and SCG on board. And from these, there's different timing intervals that can be measured. There's different sort of amplitudes. In the literature, a lot of these, the SCG signal has been studied for decades at this point, with maybe a lot of work in the early 90s from Zanetti and Salerno. And I do want to also mention a very close colleague and friend who passed away recently, Marco Di Rienzo, who together with me organized some special sessions at EMBS for several years to bring together that field. Actually, he was a wonderful researcher in that area. So what we'll end up presenting is something like what's shown here, a dashboard to the clinician that would include both hemodynamic parameters monitored by the patch, together with third-party integrated scales, cuffs, other sorts of devices, as well as synchronization to Epic or the EMR for medication information that could then be read off in parallel as well. And the idea is that this would then work within the clinical workflow, that to not be a distraction, but rather something that could be used for post-discharge monitoring, and really a lot like the sort of flowchart and paradigm that's already been developed for implantable sensors, but using this non-invasive approach instead. So, of course, the market opportunity is huge for this. I think that everybody already understands this, the number of patients with heart failure, the sort of addressable market, the value is large here. And this is kind of our roadmap in terms of the clinical studies for what we're doing. So we've done a lot of early clinical studies already in the academic setting. The goal now is to do this model generalization study. This is our seismic HF1 study that we're kicking off now. It's going to have about 12 to 15 sites across the country. We are specifically targeting sites where we'll make sure that we have diversity in the patient population. We are targeting first NYHA class 2 to 4, HFrEF as well as HFpEF, and pretty much standard right heart cath procedure together with our device. That's going to allow us to form a model for relating our device parameters to pulmonary capillary wedge pressure that's accurate and generalizable for that population. We'll then test that model in seismic HF2, which will be our pivotal that we plan on doing in our Series B timeframe. With that, then we'll be ready for a software as medical device de novo submission and post-market studies as well. So I think where we land in terms of the monitoring landscape is a non-invasive device. So in terms of form factor, it's less obtrusive than, of course, anything that's implantable, and also less obtrusive than many of the multi-parameter monitors as well that require leads to different areas on the body. At the same time, we hope that the clinical utility can be very strong because of the measurement of parameters that relate to the filling pressures really care about. So I do want to talk about this sort of platform applications that can be expanded as well beyond just heart failure. But even for heart failure, the concept of using WaveSense, which is our middleware software that we've already deployed early versions of this to aggregate large data sets of physiological waveform data. Many times if you go to the ICU, right, which of course any of the clinicians on the call have, but if you're an engineer, and you step into the ICU, you'll actually see the monitors where waveform data is being looked at all the time by clinicians, but that waveform data is typically lost. And really all that's saved is the values. And of course, there's some companies now that are trying to get around that, but it's still not very commonly done. So having some software that can store that waveform data in an appropriate way, together with the information from our device as well, is going to allow us to do a lot of powerful work on the AI side of things with waveform analytics, rather than just using features of the signals. And so we've already aggregated large data sets with early versions of this software. These are going to be used for model training as well, to be able to supplement the data that we'll be collecting in seismic HF1. And I do want to mention one other area that's kind of growing quickly recently, which is the concept of digital clinical trials. And I was lucky to actually co-lead a workshop on this that was led by the NSF, NIH, and FDA. And that took place actually right before the pandemic. One of the other people that ran that workshop was Dr. Califf, who's now, of course, leading up the FDA. And we put together a paper on sort of the future of the space in terms of digital clinical trials. And I think devices and virtual sort of platforms like the one that we're developing could really fit in well to these sorts of trials as well, to provide digital endpoints. And many pharma companies, of course, are really interested in these. I attended a workshop and spoke about our technology at this UCLA mental health workshop recently. I think there's a lot of interesting studies that could be done with the rich set of cardiovascular signals that are being monitored. Say a little bit more about the team. You know, I've mentioned, of course, Andrew, who is a grad of my lab, Ahmed and Mazi already. Luke has been a fantastic member of our team as well. He's from Northwestern, and our advisory board has really been very helpful for us from the start. Of course, Levy was there, but also we have some great folks from Jim Adams has been so helpful as well, and others from Northwestern, and Jay Pandit, who's now at Scripps as well. So they've really helped us to make sure that our technology is tightly coupled with the clinical need and workflow. And so I'll leave it there. Hopefully, a reasonable amount of time to have some questions and discussion with the panel afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have one kind of question to get us started here, Omer. So you talked a little bit about how you really see that, you know, collecting more of these data, you can start doing AI. And so I know that you've spent a lot of time trying to really deeply understand the physiology, especially of like the seismocardiology signals. So when you're thinking about AI, are you thinking about taking a sort of like naive, like we know nothing about the signal approach, or are you going to kind of leverage what you've already learned about the physiology as you approach that?
No, that's a great question. And I think that I think it's going to be more of a combination of both, because of the fact that I think our knowledge of the signal helps us not only with conventional machine learning kind of architecture where you extract features based on domain knowledge and go about it from that standpoint, but also our knowledge of the signal helps us to better understand how to do noise reduction, you know, how to understand how to relate basically the three axes to each other. The lateral axis, for example, very little is understood in the literature. So I think it's going to be a combination actually of both. And I think that the tricky thing with going with a purely black box model is that it's very hard to understand the edge cases for how it's going to fail. And the results can look really good, but actually when you look at the sort of physiology of things, you'll notice that, you know what, exactly in the cases where I need this thing to work, it doesn't work. And so I think that having the domain knowledge and the physiological understanding of where these signals come from and how they relate to the underlying events of the heart and vasculature is really important, actually.
Great, thank you. So I had one question for Harry and Angad, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mohammed to kind of lead a group discussion here. So Harry and Angad, one thing that I thought was really interesting about your work was that you do have, the pulmonary artery pressure sensor, but then you're also collecting these other data. So I was wondering if you could talk about what you see the value add of collecting the blood pressure and the weight, and also how that might affect adherence, like whether or not people are going to go through this whole 5-minute routine.
Yeah, I'll start on that. And some of it's just doing primary market research and out talking to physicians around how do they set up their remote management practice. And I trace some of this back to probably 2012, 13, going to talk to centers. Actually, we were visiting CHUM, the hospital center in Montreal. We were doing some animal work up there, went to see the cardiology department. And they had these amazing new hybrid ORs. You've got this heart team for TAVR, bringing in surgeons, interventional cardiologists. You've got this awesome commitment to delivering great care in this area. And then we ask them, well, tell me about your heart failure clinic and what you do. And well, we have heart failure clinic once a month. This is, again, a decade ago, but basically they didn't have any of the basics to get information from the patient's home to make management decisions. And so it's kind of eye-opening to us that the PA pressure sensors like this Cadillac or Tesla that you're building, and you've got a bunch of dirt roads without chargers around. So basic infrastructure is needed to scale remote management. A lot of the questions we were facing as a company were unrelated to our sensor, but adoption, scale, workflow, all that stuff. And we needed to come up with answers around that. So it was a recognition that there's a lot of building blocks that need to go into infrastructure. And then when we're talking with physicians, what would you like to see if you had an opportunity to have other metrics available? And then the feedback comes back, I'd really like to know what blood pressure is when I'm making this, or weight. I'm not going to look at those as my primary signal, but when I'm making a med change decision, it really is helpful to know that. So we listened to that and brought that into a system, which also helps get practices used to more remote management. At the time, we thought that you could start remote management non-invasively and then progress for those patients who are at higher risk. But what we've seen actually in practice right now, there's not a lot of remote management that happens within cardiology without a PA pressure sensor. Remote management can happen at the hospital level, the institution level, and post-acute care, but it's a different office that manages that. So anyway, it was really doing a lot of market research and understanding where's the real clinical need here and how do we bring a solution, not just a technology, to the problem.
Angad, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that was a great answer. And just to add to what Harry said, when we ask clinicians, what do they like about Endotronix system? They obviously appreciate the handheld reader and what it does to the patient's adherence and usability. But the next thing they mention is the comprehensive nature of the system. The fact that it's not just PA pressure, but also the other parameters helps them titrate medications better and just get a more comprehensive view of the patient. So just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you. And I think that'll transition great into some of the questions that Mohammed has. And I do want to also mention that we do still have the Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, just drop those in the Q&A. And all of our panelists have been really gracious about answering them live as well. So make sure to check the answered section to see if there's your question may have already been answered. So I'll turn it over to Mohammed.
Thanks, Maggie. Well, first of all, again, I want to thank all the panelists. That was certainly a tour de force on CHF monitoring from clinical, technological, commercial. So just a privilege just to be involved in this. So thanks to everybody. So just I want to ask a few questions, a couple of questions that did come up from the audience on a similar theme, and that was about data. And one of the questions, and I'll throw this out to all of you to get your perspective, is some folks in the audience asked about, well, this is going to be generating lots of large amounts of data. How do we effectively integrate this into an EMR and a clinical workflow? Is there a danger that this becomes a burden in terms of information overload on clinicians and other providers. Even today, when we look at some of the more simple type of devices, for example, event monitors like a Zio patch or things like that, I as a cardiac electrophysiologist have to deal with those all the time. Strikingly, it's still a very manual process. When we have our event monitors and ECGs go into our EMR, there's a lot of manual work that's still being done with device data today. Now you're talking about data that's even much higher orders of magnitude, higher scale data that's coming in all the time. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, I think the bottom line is we have to keep it simple. We learned that through the evolution of implantable hemodynamic monitoring technologies. I think scientifically we learned a lot from the original Chronicle implantable hemodynamic monitor, but it provided 24/7 hemodynamic data, and it was just too much information. And we were able to distill that down when we moved into the CardioMEMS studies to realize that a once daily measurement of pulmonary artery pressure was sufficient to manage patients in a way that helped to keep them out of the hospital. So I think we need to keep it simple. We need to present to either the clinician or perhaps directly to the patient, a simple measure of how they're doing, coupled to an algorithm of what comes next, to make it all very simple. Otherwise, we will overwhelm both clinicians and patients with too much information.
I'll add on that a little bit. Completely agree on keeping things simple for patients. One thing as an engineer coming into this space, I'm just always fascinated by the difference of training of physicians and engineers. And physicians are trained to process such complex information instantly, which is almost the opposite of engineers. Engineers are trained to think, do things over time, really isolate stuff, but clinicians process incredibly complex information all the time. And the challenge is to put it in a way that is consistent with the training. They can recognize it fast and make a decision. So they're constantly looking at a screen with 20 different parameters, and within a blink of an eye, they know exactly what they need to do for that patient. So when I think about data presentation, it's really what is the therapy you're trying to deliver? And we're not acute care delivery. So really isolating what we are not helps us focus on what we are. And it is a once a day measurement. The clinical use case is chronic management. It's a change, a clinical decision that's not happening every instant of every day. That's exactly who we're not. That happens in the ICU, and there's tremendous amount of lots of data, lots of monitoring that happens there. But when an action comes up, there's a trigger, and then you want to present the complex information very simply, which clinicians are trained to do. So it's just saying we're not acute emergency medicine. We don't need continuous streams of data constantly going into the EHR. But once a trigger is met and you need to intervene and have a therapeutic action for a patient, clinicians can go in and have the information they need right at their fingertips.
And just to follow up to that, as we're talking more about how AI machine learning is advancing, do you think that we will get to the stage of having a type of near closed loop feedback? So not only presenting the data, are there going to be other technologies evolving that suggest actions on what you do with the data in terms of what the next best step is? And are there folks out there working on that now?
Maybe I'll just jump in on this. I mean, I think that in other fields, certainly, right? So this is, I have some colleagues that are doing some amazing work in neuromodulation where they have both sensing and delivery of stimulation through DBS systems, deep brain stimulation systems, and they've had fantastic results. And there's really, I think, exciting algorithmic advances there in terms of latent state estimation through Kalman, like modified Kalman filters that sort of work really well in practical settings. And then, of course, you have the CGM example as well, right? In another sort of field. So here, though, I don't know, right? So here, I think that you have to have a vehicle. I mean, even so, before I was at Countryman, actually, I did a short stint at Alza Corporation, which was a J&J company. And we're really interested in closed loop drug delivery systems. And it's really like the vehicle to deliver the care, has to be something that can also be fast acting, and where you have sort of the volume of, let's say, dose of the medicine that would make sense in that setting, right? So I do think, though, there's interesting opportunities maybe with systems like CVRX. I'd be interested to hear what the latest is on that. Actually, I don't even know, but other sorts of neuromodulatory approaches for heart failure that, at least in the early days, had some interesting results, and I just haven't heard anything about it since then. Maybe there's ways that sensors could be tied in with those sorts of systems where you do have an opportunity to act in real time and maybe affect autonomic state.
I can add to that. So AI definitely has a role to play. It's a great question, and particularly as you measure more parameters. So as you add more parameters, there's a risk that you may overload the clinician with too much information. And that's where AI can really help in making sense of it, keeping it simple, like Dr. Abraham said. And really, if you look at the future of healthcare, it's going to be more predictive, more personalized. And that's where AI can really help. And not only help with the outcomes by making care more personalized, but also with the workflow, which is so important, as the points have been made already. And really, AI can facilitate the workflow as well, whether it's features in your platform that present data. And by the way, that user interface, how you present the information, extremely important, like Harry mentioned, and how that integrates into the clinic workflow is so important. And, as a medical device engineer, I often ask the question, so what is actually the product here when we implant the sensor? And the product really is the actionable data that's given to the clinician. And and device makers have some responsibility in sort of simplifying what it means and pairing clear treatment guidelines to the data. Because without that, you're not going to get the effectiveness that you need to generate the evidence you need to make this adopted.
Excellent. Now, I'm just going to ask a couple questions that came from the audience. One question was about how would these modalities that are looking at PA pressure deal with the situation where the pressure is changing not because of volume buildup, but perhaps more from changes in PA vascular resistance? For example, like in pulmonary hypertension or other types of disease pathophysiologies.
Dr. Amer, you want to take that one, or I can do it?
I'm happy to. I just didn't want to jump in too soon in case you guys wanted to weigh in here. But look, I think that there are a number of considerations here. First of all, many of our heart failure patients have secondary pulmonary hypertension. So you have to understand the relationship sort of starting out between PA pressure and left atrial pressure or pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, and take that into account in terms of your treatment goals. That process or that relationship can be dynamic. And so, one always needs to take into, account, the context in which one is interpreting the pulmonary artery pressure data relative to what's known about the status of the pulmonary circulation in these patients. But beyond the pulmonary circulation, the systemic circulation is also important in this issue of venous capacitance, and its ability to dynamically modulate preload or filling pressure or PA pressure is important to take into account as well. And that's why if you look at our treatment algorithms, the ones we've used with PA-guided heart failure therapy, while they're primarily diuretic-based, they also include consideration for using venous vasodilators like long-acting nitrates to address that vascular component or dynamic component or non-volume based component that can result in elevations of cardiac preload as well. So there still is a lot of thought that goes into interpretation of this data and treatment selection. And this may be another area in which AI will help us in the future.
And to build on that, those two themes, when we think about guidance that you can offer, or even information that you present, even if it's not guidance, to a nurse on the front line or an NP or a physician. PA pressure's up, okay, there's a trigger, let me look at this patient. But is their systolic or systemic blood pressure also high? I might treat that patient differently than if their systemic blood pressure is low. And then how do you present that information with triggers? So the AI comes in there, and really, I think this area, we are very early on in it in heart failure. So go back to that diabetes analogy. There's a lot of patient education just culturally built up over time around patients managing their own glucose. They understand it at a very granular level. And we are only now getting into an area where patients are understanding what is happening in their intracardiac pressure and learning about it. How do they respond to that? And so this is an area where FDA is influential in managing patient risk and benefit. And there are a lot of risks because it's unknown. We haven't done it before. So we're moving into this area where patients are seeing their data. We have recommendations coming in, and you're always balancing that unknown of where's there a risk to the patient that we just haven't discovered yet. So how do we move into that field safely? So I absolutely think it's a future, just like where you see the Libre and Dexcom and diabetes today, but we're just getting started in it in heart failure.
One question I had was, and Dr. Abraham, in the beginning of your talk, you talked about the importance of absolute values rather than relative ones. And I kind of see that there could be a bit of a tension when we think about a focus on absolute values versus focus on personalized medicine. So do you see a tension there, or kind of how do you balance those things?
Yeah, no, I think that, the concept of having absolute and really actionable information, really more fully supports personalized healthcare. In this regard, we know that, while we have defined a target range or normal range for, say, example, pulmonary artery pressure, that some patients do better, at one end of that spectrum versus the other, right? And so we start to, as we get to know the patients and how they're doing, relative to what their pressures are, we do refine those ranges in some cases. Some patients, do quite well with very low pressures. You're looking at pulmonary diastolic pressures in the low single digits, and they feel best there and do well there, and they don't have dehydration events. Other patients, you can never quite get the PA pressure all the way down to the target zone. And so you have to make some adaptation on the higher end of the spectrum. But any lowering of the PA pressure seems to be associated with a reduced risk of heart failure hospitalization. So, and I would say that is much more difficult to refine if we're looking at relative changes rather than absolute values here. At one time I was quite excited. You can find some old papers I wrote about transthoracic impedance guided care, and then subsequently with intrathoracic impedance. But we got to the point where we realized that we just didn't know what to do. If you had an optivol threshold crossing, what does that mean? What do you do? It doesn't prompt you to just increase the dose of the diuretic. Says maybe something's going on here. The positive predictive value is quite low. Maybe something's going on here. What do I do? Maybe I see the patient more often. Maybe I worry about them a bit more, but I really don't know what to do with that, with that relative change in some lung volume measure.
Another question I got was, in terms of a modality is, there was some work done quite some time back on looking at Valsalva maneuvers as a way of assessing fluid responsiveness, and whether it's also a measure of congestion. How has that technology played out, and do you see any role for that in CHF monitoring? And again, I'll throw that to anybody amongst you.
I mean, I think probably it'd be interesting to hear Dr. Abraham's perspective on this, but I'll just jump in really quickly. In terms of Valsalva maneuver, we did quite a bit of work with Valsalvas in the lab with healthy subjects, with patients, trying to modulate kind of physiological characteristics with that. I think the hardest thing that I found with Valsalva is to make it so the person does it correctly. And, there's sort of devices where you can measure the pressure that they kind of hold it at, but I think that still it takes sort of a level of effort from the person to even just perform the maneuver in a way that's repeatable and accurate that makes it hard from the sensing standpoint. I think another side of it is the sensor data you get during Valsalva is pretty noisy because the person is straining themselves. You get sort of this reflex kind of reduction in pulse pressure, and that means that you also have reduction in a lot of the signal amplitude of at least the non-invasive signals that you measure. And then you just basically get a couple heartbeats afterwards when the person releases, where you get bigger sort of responses. So it's hard to really, it's very transient, it's very noisy, and it's hard to reproduce, in my opinion. But that's kind of from a signal analysis standpoint. We can hear about sort of the clinical and physiology perspective now as well.
Omar, I agree with you completely. In small studies with highly motivated patients who were doing this with with an investigator or research coordinator at the bedside, we could get some reasonable and reproducible measures. I don't know that it really is, is generalizable in the clinical setting to do so. The one way in which we've used it previously with that original heart pod system, that leaded left atrial pressure monitoring system, we did use Valsalvas as a way to, serially evaluate the accuracy of the LAP measure and to recalibrate for any drift that occurred. But again, small number of patients, really a very rigorous approach, to coaching the patient and assessing the, let's say, goodness of the Valsalva, done to take those measurements.
Well, another question, again, I'm not seeing, Maggie, unless you had another question, one thing that I also wanted to ask, speaking as a cardiac electrophysiologist and somebody who implants biventricular ICDs for folks who have heart failure, do you see any role of having some type of closed loop feedback between these types of MEMS devices that do pressure monitoring to optimize biventricular ICD settings and identifying the right vectors for pacing? Has anybody done any work in that area?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any, but I think conceptually it's appealing. Look, we set all the dials for the delivery of cardiac resynchronization therapy in patients, at rest at at one point in time, under a certain condition, whatever it happens to be that day in terms of their volume status or their intracardiac and pulmonary pressures. But we know that those relationships change, when their volume status changes, those relationships change with exercise or changes in heart rate, and to be able to more dynamically evaluate and modulate, I think the delivery of CRT would be exciting. One could envision, other closed loop systems as well. Perhaps the physician-directed patient self-management system is a sort of closed loop delivery system, but it requires, patient adherence to look at their number and implement their treatment change. It may not be too far out in the future to think about really linking in a closed loop system some of these therapies to, some of these monitors to a therapy delivery system, right? We do that now with diabetes, continuous glucose monitor, continuous infusion, subcutaneous delivery of glucose, which in my experience, results in exquisite, control of blood glucose. And one might think about, combining some of these technologies with either subcutaneous or intravenous or implantable pump systems that could give patients just the right amount of diuretic when they really need it.
Thinking a little bit about invasive versus non-invasive, I think kind of what we're hearing right now is invasive is the gold standard. And so how good does non-invasive have to be for it to be the choice? So Dr. Abraham talked a little bit about immediately post-hospitalization, but I'm kind of thinking more long-term, like how good does non-invasive have to be to justify using that over invasive?
Yeah, for me, we often look at a correlation plot to see how well the non-invasive systems compare to an invasive measurement, perhaps considered a gold standard measurement for correlation. I really like to look at Bland-Altman plots, and I like to be able to set the boundaries for those Bland-Altman approaches around variance that I think is clinically significant. So, a correlation of 0.8 or 0.85 seems like a very good correlation, but I want to know, how often is it likely, how often are those measurements going to fall out of clinical bounds such that I might make a bad treatment decision about a patient, right? If 20% of the time patients have a measurement that falls, say more than, 8 or 10 millimeters of mercury, outside of what is really the pulmonary artery pressure, I could make a bad decision. I could over-diurese a patient, for example, or, if it's in the other direction, I might not appreciate the fact that they're actually congested today. So I really like to see those boundaries and take into account what I think is a reasonable degree of clinical tolerance for variability between the non-invasive assessment and the invasive one. So I think if we have non-invasive tools that are, within a relatively narrow range, according to this Bland-Altman analysis, 3 millimeters of mercury, 5 millimeters of mercury difference, clinically, I think I can tolerate that and still make good treatment decisions that are unlikely to put patients at increased risk. If you get up to 8 or 10 millimeters of mercury in a reasonably high proportion of patients, then I think it becomes a problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point with the limits of agreement. I think that makes a lot of sense. What is the current standard for implantables compared to right heart cath in terms of their mean absolute deviation and limits of agreement?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, we've been looking at this about plus or minus 5.
Okay.
As being acceptable. And then the other controversy is, actually, which is more accurate, a fluid-filled right heart catheter or one of these electronic, for example, MEMS-based, sensors. And we use the Swan-Ganz catheter as the gold standard, but perhaps it's no longer a gold standard. We generally haven't, done a lot of, use Millar catheters or other approaches that might be a little bit more accurate than the Swan. But that's part of the debate too. When you see a little bit more variance between the implantable sensor and the Swan-Ganz catheter, is the variance really due to the Swan and not the sensor? So we've debated that a lot and what the real gold standard here is now.
Yeah, that's such a hard problem here, right? I mean, with everything.
Yeah.
Is 5 the standard deviation or the 95%? Like, is it?
It's on the Bland-Altman.
But 2 standard deviations or 1 is 5?
So we've looked at it as 2, I think, for most of those. Yeah.
So that's something we think about a lot as well too. And you talk about signal analysis and what's the system of measurement. The system of measurement includes a baseline calibration from a right heart catheterization of a very busy cath lab. Mm-hmm. And they don't pay attention to leveling and how do you read which is the signal that you're actually calibrating to. So there's multiple errors that get introduced there. And then in the system of measurement, you also have the patient in the time of day and what have they been doing right before that measurement, which is very different from the acute setting. Everything's adapted from acute, patients on the bed, you know exactly how they've been, you control everything tightly, and then you move into an area where the patient just walked upstairs and took a measurement and they're halfway inclined. That's very different than if they had been sitting on the couch all day, laying down and taking that measurement. So all of this introduces potential clinical error in what you're trying to assess. So understanding patient variability around using the product the way you want, come back to the Valsalva technique, it really comes into play when you're in chronic management in that home setting, and patients they will test your product in ways that you could never imagine as an engineer in a lab. So
Yeah, I'll add one thing that, when trying to validate a non-invasive technology against the SWAN, I think it's really important that, one record the waveforms and use a centralized hemodynamic core laboratory, to read them, not the machine read numbers, that come off. They're just absolutely the worst, right? So it's really, I think if you do it really robustly in that fashion, you come close. But you're still dealing with some of the inherent variability within a fluid-filled catheter. So,
Excellent. Well, given that Thomas Health is our MC and he's also my ex-office mate when I at MIT, one thing he taught me is don't go over. So, with that, I first would like to thank everybody on our panel today. It was a privilege again, and wonderful learning experience for me, and wish you the best in your continued pioneering studies. And with that, I'll hand it back to Thomas.
Yeah, and I just add to that I'm not always successful in my teaching to Mohammed. So with that, let me also thank the distinguished speakers for a very, very interesting session, and the co-chairs for stewarding us back through the session, and the audience for their questions. I learned a lot, and I hope that many of you will tune in again tomorrow for our last day of this online health tech conference, when we talk about future technologies. So thanks again for all to all the speakers, co-chairs, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.